Hey everybody, this is the first chapter of John Rosenthal's book, The Myth of Dialectics, Reinterpreting the Marx-Hegel Relation. This book is from 1998. Probably not going to read this whole book. I just want to read the stuff at the beginning of it. And since the stuff at the beginning is quite short, I'm going to read the first chapter, which is also very short. So, contents. Part 1, Marx's Capital and the Myth of quote, Dialectics. Chapter 1, quote, Rigmarole, or quote, Method. Chapter 2, Marx on the, quote, Marx-Hegel relation. With the headings, the, quote, famous quotations, quote, Dialectics and the concept of historical change, the third founder, or I. Kaufmann's, quote, Marxism. Chapter 3, quote, Dialectics, Historicity, and the Logic of Marx's Capital. With the headings, 1, the Historicist Discourse, 2, the Varieties of Historicism, 3, the, quote, Method of Capital as Dynamic Historicism, the Poverty of the Historicist Interpretation, the Historicist Model and Hegel, the Historicity of Capitalist Production, and the Critique of Political Economy. Part 2 is titled Reification and Exchange. Chapter 4, Concepts and Objects. Section 1, the Categories of Political Economy. Section 2, the Division of Labor and the Concept of Society. Section 3, the Dual Objectivity of Money and Commodities. 4, did I say chapter the last one? These are parts of chapter 4. Or sections of chapter 4. The, quote, practical concepts of exchange. Chapter 5, property and person, or the birth of the juridical subject. Chapter 6, the objectification of social relations, with the headings, money as social relation, capital as a social relation, a brief digression on rent, capital as a social relation continued. Chapter 7, a, quote, idealism of matter, end quote. Part 3 is titled, quote, Dialectical, Contradiction and the Logicization of the Empirical. Chapter 8, the Two Principles of Contradiction. Chapter 9, the Word Made Flesh, or Hegel's Incarnation of Logic. With the headings, quote, Logic as Pars Totalis of the Hegelian System. The universal and the particular in, quote, Geist, the universal and the particular in nature. Chapter 10 is titled, the, quote, Reality of Contradiction, with the headings, Truth and Falsity in an Extra-Logical Sense, Hegel on Judgment, the Hegelian, quote, Syllogism, and the Syllogism, quote, Real Syllogisms and, quote, Living Judgments, the Basic Principle of Materialism, Wilt and Diego on the, quote, Identity of Opposites, the Paralogical Hinge of Hegel's Exposition, the Opposite of Limitation, quote, Contradiction before Judgment, the, quote, Reality of Contradiction. Appendix, Hegel's, quote, Transition of Identity into Difference. Part 4, the Objectivity of the Economic. Chapter 11, a Fortuitous Theoretical Isomorphism. Chapter 12, the, quote, Subject-Predicate Reversal, an excursus on Marx's Critique of Hegel's Doctrine of the State, with the headings, quote, The Illusion of Real Knowledge, end quote, an example, the Hegelian, quote, Derivation of the Monarch. Chapter 13, some passing remarks on the, quote, New Hegelian Marxism. Chapter 14, the universal and the particular in the constitution of value. Section 1, value relation and value form. Section 2, the extrinsic and intrinsic measure of value. Chapter 15, Money or the Real Universality of Commodities. Chapter 1, The Principle of Contradiction and the Necessity of Money. Section 1, The Principle of Contradiction and the Necessity of Money. Section 2, The Medium of Exchange to Measure Value. 3, The Money Commodity and its Proxies. 4, The Standard of Price. 5, The Christ of Commodities. 16, The Metaphysics of Value. On second-order objectivity. Preface. This volume might appear to have an esoteric theme, and indeed it does. The, quote, Marx-Hegel relation, end quote, and the mysteries of, quote, dialectics, which are commonly supposed to comprise its core. It also, however, has a thoroughly mundane theme, money and the distinctive mode of sociality, viz., quote, the market, or commodity exchange of which money is the indispensable instrument. My reasons for coming to the latter theme by way of the tortuous detour of the former have to do, no doubt, with such biographical accidents as induce an individual to train in philosophy, but also on the, quote, macro level, with some recent developments, quote, there's no quote, there's just dirt on the PDF. With some recent developments in intellectual history, and more specifically in the history of, quote, Marxism. In light of the collapse of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and the widespread and increasing aggressive rejection of Marx's theoretical legacy, which accompanied the latter, one of the more surprising intellectual developments of recent years has been a certain revival in academic circles of specifically Hegelian Marxism, at least inasmuch as the Anglo-American context is concerned. The impulse for this, quote, return to Hegel, end quote, among Marxist scholars can be supposed to have derived in large measure from a somewhat earlier event of a quite different order, namely the emergence in the mid-1980s of an alleged, quote, analytical reformulation of Marx, employing the methodological tools of modern neoclassical economics. This, quote, reformulation of Marx quickly revealed itself in the work of its most prominent exponents, John Roemer and John Elster, likewise to represent an outright rejection, albeit of ostensibly socialist inspiration, of almost everything customarily associated with Marx, and thus demanded a response from more traditionally minded Marxists. Among the latter, many knew of no better way to counter Elster's and Roemer's assault on the Marxian canon than to cite Lenin's aphorism to the effect that, quote, it is impossible to understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having studied the whole of Hegel's logic, end quote. The defenders of Marx could be assured that their exponents would not await any mystical illumination which required so strict a discipline. Substantive debate between the two camps thus being largely precluded, they turned to the task of commentary and the disclosure of, quote, correspondences between the Marxian and Hegelian corpora, quote, correspondences which often seem to be imbued with a sort of Kabbalistic significance, since their social analytical import too often remained unclarified. In any case, henceforth, the recapturing of Marx's original insight was once again supposed to depend upon a correct appreciation of his, quote, dialectical method. In the book that I'm reading now, The Myth of Dialectics, I have wanted to chart a kind of theoretical, quote, third way, which avoids the alternative of, quote, analytical or Hegelian Marxism. I have wanted to establish that, yes, there is something more, indeed, much more, to Marx's political economy than what can be grasped with the tools of neoclassical economics. But, no, that something more is not, quote, dialectics. It is, I suggest, the Marxian theory of value. The latter has been widely misconstrued as a peculiar theory of price formation, a, quote, labor theory of value, and, quote, distinguishable from that of Ricardo only, say, by its greater refinement or even just the unnecessary obtruseness of its Hegeloid trappings. But I argue that Marx's theory is in fact sui generis, and that its object is not, or at least not in the first instance, the system of prices, but rather the form of value itself, which the coalescence of many determinate price system presupposes. inasmuch as it must gain existence as something really distinct from the particular goods whose value gets not only expressed in it, but also precisely incarnated by it. This value form of the commodity is, namely, the money form. Apart from the latter, all the various value phenomena discernible in the circulation sphere of a capitalist economy, prices, wages, profits, and so on, would lack the very medium of their existence. Marx's so-called, quote, value theory is, then, from the outset a theory of money and a theory of it's weird. It's hard to explain here. Marx's so-called, quote, value theory is, then, from the outset a theory of money, in italics, and a theory of money, not in italics. I am suggesting in a unique sense which finds no exact parallel in either neoclassical economics or classical political economy. It is indeed remarkable that this is so often overlooked and that Marx gets attributed a, quote, value theory on the Ricardian pattern, for Marx himself was unequivocal in identifying the lack of any analysis of the value form, even as some monetary unit had continually to be employed in the manner of a numeraire for other theoretical purposes, as the, quote, fundamental deficiency, in quote, of classical political economy. Thus, for example, in Marx's theories of surplus value, Marx dismisses the section of Ricardo's Principles, I think it's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, I can't remember the exact title, on the, quote, measure of value, as, quote, without anything significant. The connection between value's imminent measure through labor time, and the necessity for an external measure of value of commodities is not grasped, not even raises a question, end quote. Later on in the same text, he remarked more succinctly, quote, Ricardo misjudges the importance of the market because he does not understand the nature of money, end quote. Marx. Now it is precisely in the development of this value theory, and indeed as Lenin's Marx suggests, most notably in the very first chapter of Capital Volume 1, that Marx makes systematic use of linguistic formulae bearing a distinctly Hegelian stamp. Hence the more acute of the, quote, new Hegelian Marxists have quite rightly placed special emphasis upon it. I will argue here, however, that the presence of such apparently Hegelian formulae in the discourse of Capital has absolutely nothing to do with any adoption of Marx's part of a, quote, dialectical method, inasmuch as the scientific legitimacy of Marx's analysis is concerned. This is all to the good, since, as I will try to show in some detail, the, quote, method, which Hegel's own exposition tends most characteristically to follow, is not in fact logical in character at all, but rather paralogical. And paralogical means relating to a form of reasoning which does not conform to the rules of logic. And the example is, quote, these thought forms belong to a paralogical world of symbol and fantasy, end quote. Right to the text. As for the particular part of Hegel's system which bears the title of, quote, logic, and which is after a fashion, quote, identical with the whole of the system, this represents a kind of esoteric philosophy with deep roots in Christian mysticism. The formulae most closely associated with Hegelian, quote, dialectic, concerning, for instance, the, quote, unity and or, quote, identity of opposites, and the, quote, reality of contradiction which is supposed to follow therefrom, are, in their original Hegelian context, unintelligible apart from this mystical background. It so happens, however, that the very object of Marx's value theory exhibits a structure which lends itself to being grasped in such formulae as, when applied to, quote, first order, physical reality, as they are in Hegel's usage, have an unmistakably idealist connotation. Herein, I suggest, lies the whole paradox and mystery of the, quote, Marx-Hegel relation, end quote. then Marx is able to make a rational scientific application precisely of Hegel's mysticism. He is able to do so because money is, in effect, with respect to commodities, just such a, quote, existent universal, unquote, as the Christ is supposed to be with respect to Christians. It is nothing other than the universality implicit to all commodities as, quote, exchange values, unquote, existing alongside them in the form of some particular commodity or, quote, use value. More precisely, this is so just for the historically primordial form of money, viz. Commodity money. I'll try to show, however, that inasmuch as the formal peculiarities of the money commodity are impressed upon it by virtue of the economic functions which it is called upon to discharge, so too must such peculiarities be reflected in any more sophisticated sort of monetary device as well. The, quote, metaphysical subtleties, unquote, of money pose a problem with which economic theory in the usual sense, for which the availability of a monetary unit in which to express value magnitudes is for the most part just a stroke of luck or theoretical contrivance, does not bother much to address. Namely, why in fact is there money at all? Why do the diverse elements of the social product require a mysterious, quote, acquire a mysterious, quote, value objectivity, unquote, which has to be not only in principle, but really distinct from their, quote, first order, unquote, objectivity as physical things? The solution to this problem is not to be found in any special intricacy of Hegelian, quote, logic, but rather in certain special requirements of commodity exchange. In examining the specificity of the exchange system here, I'll try to show that what circulates among persons in the objective form of money is in substance nothing other than control over definite portions of the total labor requisite to social production. Since the overwhelming majority of the world's population now find their practical working lives subjected to the anonymous dictates of the market, an effort to understand the social meaning of the money form will not, I hope, seem entirely without relevance. John Rosenthal, London. Acknowledgements. I would first of all like to express my gratitude to the late Rainer Schurmann. I am sure Rainer did not share my enthusiasm for Marx, but he had no interest or stake in promoting ideological conformity, and hence was prepared to lend his support to a project based strictly upon his judgment of its intellectual merits. In a more general academic environment, which is not always very conducive to the sort of scholarship which this work represents, he helped create the niche within which I was able to pursue it, and I'll always be very grateful for that. I first happened upon many of the basic ideas which would eventually issue in this book while attending seminars on Hegel given by Rudiger Bübner. I don't know that Professor Bübner would agree with much that is contained in these pages, but I am very grateful for the opportunity which he provided me to study Hegel and also the, quote, young Marx in an unbiased setting, and grateful too for the solicitude which he showed for my intellectual development at that time and after. I would like to thank Ross Thompson for being a broad-minded enough economist to take an interest in this project, and for the many helpful comments he offered at various stages in its development. I have to thank Ross, too, for exhibiting an apparently above-average memory for banal events and the honesty to use it, which qualities did, strangely enough, prove crucial at one juncture in the institutional history of this document. I would also like to express my gratitude to two other economists, Salimullah Khan and Robert J. King, for their readiness to transgress disciplinary boundaries and to let them be transgressed, which made for many enjoyable and productive discussions with both. My conversations with Salim on the history of money were especially helpful to me as I was composing the last part of the book. Needless to say, any errors I have made in utilizing his suggestions are entirely of my own devising. During a brief period at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, I had the good fortune to get to know and to study it with Robert Ackerman. Bob's criticisms of a very early draft of the first part of this work helped me to break my dependence upon the Althusserian account of, quote, historicism, and to develop what I hope is a more nuanced account of my own. I want to thank him in particular for that, and more generally for all the guidance and encouragement he has provided over the years. Finally, I owe a special debt of gratitude to Vol Zuchting. I don't know if I'm saying that right. We have never met, but the old-fashioned philosophical correspondence and exchange of texts which we have conducted over the last several years has been for me at any rate a continual source of enlightenment and amusement. Wall's detailed criticisms of my dissertation exposed all the hollow spots in that text and provided me great impetus to rethink and refine my arguments as I converted the latter into the present volume. I cannot be sure that he will find that his criticisms have been effectively met, and indeed I am sure in certain places that they have not been. Nonetheless, I am sure that this book is significantly better for his having made them. Note: Vol Zuchting died in January 1997. The preceding words are written in December 1996. They are written to be read by Vol, and I leave them as is. Vol knew all the details of the difficult period of gestation of this volume, and his interest and encouragement and insight helped me enormously to focus on the task at hand and bring it to completion. I am very sorry that he is not here to see the outcome. Okay, so part 1, Marx's Capital and the Myth of, quote, Dialectics. And this is the chapter that I'm reading. Again, this book does seem interesting, but I am trying to just get an overall feel for Marx literature in the past 50 years or so. Quote, rigmarole or, quote, method? Question mark. The persistence of a, quote, certain Hegelian phraseology, end quote, in the discourse of Marx's Capital has been much remarked upon. For professional economists of what we could call a broadly neoclassical inspiration, it has been a source of constant annoyance, a, quote, metaphysical residue worthy only of ridicule and contempt, at best an irrelevance and at worst an obstacle to serious scientific inquiry. The special target of abuse for Marx's critics among the economists has been his theory of value, as developed at the very outset of the first volume of Marx's Capital. Even if other aspects of Marx's economics deserve, at least ostensibly, more studied consideration, the attitude toward his value theory has been one of simple dismissal, and such lack of engagement could always be justified by summarizing everything which the critics found most distasteful and inaccessible about the theory under the epithet of, quote, Hegelianism. In more recent times, self-styled, quote, analytic Marxists, end quote, who are, much like the aspiring Romanian entrepreneur I met not long ago, Marxist, quote, dans leurs cours, dans leur cours, I have no idea what the hell that means, or how to pronounce it, but let's look it up.
Dans leur cœur.
Dans leur cœur, which means in their hearts. In more recent times, self-styled, quote, analytical Marxists, who are, much like the aspiring Romanian entrepreneur I met not long ago, Marxist dans leur cœur, but stridently neoclassical in their theoretical practice, and indeed openly anti-Marxist in their estimations of most everything usually associated with Marx, and have followed the same sort of procedure in claiming to have developed a, quote, Marxian theory of exploitation, end quote, on the basis of the postulates of general equilibrium analysis. Hence a, quote, Marxian theory of exploitation, end quote, which has been, quote, liberated from the Marxian theory of value, as is customary in this sort of discourse. The charge of, quote, Hegelianism is offered as all the justification which is needed for not entering into the intricacies of the latter theory, and thus placing oneself at risk of discovering what it is about. Indeed, it is typically assumed by Marx's critics that they already know what his theory of value is about, or at any rate that it ought to be what it ought to be about. The actual ratios at which commodities exchange, or more precisely, the uniform expression of their exchangeability, price. Marx's theory of value is supposed, in short, to fulfill the role of a theory of price formation. Once this supposition is admitted, it is natural enough to conclude, following Bumbaverk's famous critique, which is on this channel, by the way, that the theory is set out at the start of Volume 1 of Capital.
Dinner's ready.
All right, I'll be in. At the start of Volume 1 of Capital, stands in contradiction to Marx's theory of prices of production as developed in Volume 3, which is supposed to be, as Joan Robinson once put it, just quote everyone's theory, end quote. One second. There's a footnote here.
Your dad said dinner was ready.
Yeah, I'm coming in. I hate endnotes like poison. Okay, so where the hell am I? Let me reread the last sentence. Once this supposition is admitted, it is natural enough to conclude, following Bumbaverk's famous critique, that the theory is set out at the start of Volume 1 of Capital stands in contradiction to Marx's theory of prices of production as developed in Volume 3, which is supposed to be, as Joan Robinson once put it, just quote everyone's theory, end quote. Footnote. Cited in Roman Rosenthal, The Making of Marx's Capital, this remark, incidentally, considering its source, underscores the appurtenance of Keynesian economic theory to the neoclassical tradition. What's appurtenance mean? Loyalty? Fidelity? Consistency? That's the... appurtenance. Appurtenance is how it's pronounced. Appurtenance. An accessory or other item associated with a particular activity or style of living. And the example is all the appurtenances of luxurious travel. I guess all the things that go along with luxurious travel. So in this sentence, this remark, incidentally, considering its source, underscores that, let's see how it's pronounced again. Appurtenance of Keynesian economic theory to the neoclassical tradition. Virtually the only passage from Volume 1 which ever gets discussed in such treatments, and Bumbaverk here too set the precedent, is that in which Marx deduces from an equation representing the value equivalence of two commodities in exchange, quote, for example, 1 quarter wheat equals 1 hundredweight of iron, end quote, that abstract labor must constitute that in respect to which this equivalence is established. The famous, quote, third thing, which is in and of its and for itself, neither the one nor the other, end quote. Capital Volume 1. The attentiveness with which even just this passage gets considered, however, can be gauged by the glib observation which represents the customary response to it, namely that Marx's deduction is obviously mistaken, since the equivalence in question could just as well be established between rather the, quote, utilities of the compared commodities. This after the citation of a passage whose final paragraph begins, quote, if then we disregard the use value of commodities, ... end quote. Footnote. For a characteristic example, see Robert Paul Wolff's book, Understanding Marx, A Reconstruction and Critique of Capital. Where the hell am I? Bumbarvik himself, incidentally, does not ignore the fact that Marx claimed explicitly to be justified in abstracting from the utility of commodities. Whereas he acknowledges Marx's procedure, however, his dismay over it is so great that, having apparently exhausted the tools of theoretical critique, he is finally led to engage in psychological speculations concerning the motivations which could have compelled a fellow as smart as Marx, quote, an intellectual force of the very highest order, end quote, to have made such a foolish proposal. See Eugen von Bumbarvik, Karl Marx and the Close of a System, which I said is on this channel. We will be inclined to share Bumbarvik's incredulity only if we share too his conviction, for which no argument is given, that the subjective usefulness of goods is as susceptible of measurement and quantitative comparison as the labor expenditures requisite for their production. End footnote. In any event, by focusing upon Marx's deduction of the so-called, quote, substance of value, such readings manage to overlook the fact that the greater part of Marx's initial value analysis is dedicated to what he himself called a, quote, genetic derivation of the value form. A, quote, genetic derivation of the value form. With respect to this value form analysis, allusions to, quote, rigmarole, quote, Hegelian mumbo-jumbo, end quote, and so on, are normally presented as sufficient to make all discussion superfluous. In contrast, though I want in fact to suggest that this prima facie contrast expresses a more fundamental uniformity, those few professional economists who claim allegiance to the Marxian theory of value have taken up the epithet of, quote, Hegelianism and recast it as a commendation. For, quote, Marxists in the discipline, in other words, for, quote, Marxist simplex, being neither, quote, neo nor, quote, analytical, certain Hegelian residues in Marx's analysis have been served to suggest a criterion for the greater scientificity of his alleged procedure as against that of his opponents. Thus the accusation leveled at Marx by the neoclassicals to the effect that his theory of value is unnecessarily burdened with, quote, metaphysical entities has been turned back against them. If the neoclassicals insist upon the phenomenal form of economic experience, for example, the system of relative prices, the, quote, Marxists respond by pointing to the seemingly well-known fact that it is the task of science to rend the veil of such immediate, quote, appearances in order to get at the, quote, essences revealed in them. For instance, the very system of values which the neoclassicals eschew as irrelevant, it may seem odd that social scientists of professional, quote, professed, quote, materialist convictions would choose to employ a rhetoric which in Hegel's usage was designed precisely to affirm what he himself identified as the basic hypothesis of idealism, that concerning the irreality of the objects of sensuous perception, or in other words, of the material world. Footnote. See Science of Logic. Quote, the proposition that the infinite is ideal constitutes idealism. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than in recognizing the finite has no veritable being. Every philosophy is essentially an idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle, ... A philosophy which ascribed veritable ultimate absolute being to finite existence as such would not deserve the name of philosophy. The principles of ancient or modern philosophies, water or matter, or atoms, are thoughts, universals, ideal entities, not things as they immediately present themselves to us, that is, in their sensuous individuality, ... End quote. Hegel, Science of Logic. For the connection between this, quote, constitutive proposition, and quote, of idealism and the essence-appearance couplet, see, for instance, Science of Logic 58, Part 2, or I'm not sure. End footnote. Nonetheless, the frequency with which pronouncements of this tenor emanate from the, quote, Marxist camp in the economic debates is impossible to ignore. Footnote. For rather self-conscious examples, see Ernst Mandel's Introduction to Capital Volume 1 and Paul Bucara's Sur la mise en mouvement du capital, published in 1978. Anwar Sheikh's more casual remark made in criticizing the, quote, neo-Ricardian Ian Steedman can serve as representative for the genre of, quote, Steedman goes on to say that because the value rate of profit is, quote, unknown to capitalists, and, quote, it is, quote, not a significant rate of profit in a capitalist economy, end quote. How extraordinary it is to claim that only what, quote, the capitalists know, end quote, is significant. In other words, that appearances are significant but essences are not, exclamation point. In one stroke, Steedman throws out all science, end quote. Anwar Sheikh, in the article Neo-Ricardian Economics, A Wealth of Algebra, a Poverty of Theory, published in 1982. Needless to say, such observations derive their quality of self-evidence from a number of scattered remarks to be found in Marx's own corpus. For a more subtle and interesting use of the same sort of formula, Marx's point is that it is, quote, contrary to appearances, end quote, to expect that profit should be explicable on the basis of the exchange of equivalents. See the book Value, Price, and Profit, collected in Wage, Labor, and Capital / Value, Price, and Profit, published in 1976. End footnote. Such an unexpected outpouring of sympathy for the Hegelian conception of philosophical science from within economics has not, however, typically had the consequence that what was discarded as, quote, metaphysical and, quote, irrelevance by the neoclassicals has been reclaimed as theoretical foundation by the, quote, Marxists. If Hegelian formulae put to work in Marx's value theory do not present an obstacle to the, quote, Marxist in the discipline, this is more often than not simply a question of having gotten around them in a less overtly hostile manner than one's neoclassical or neo-Ricardian or post-Keynesian colleagues. It may not be necessary to excise the first chapter of Capital, the chapter on the commodity or the value form as such, in order to make Marx palatable. And it may even be possible to invest the essence/appearance couplet with a more modern set of connotations by asserting the primacy of values as the, quote, intrinsic regulators, and, quote, of prices, though in practice this connection most often gets forgotten when the time comes to discuss the dynamics of capitalist competition through which prices are actually set, and hence the promised causal relation tends to get degraded to something more in the order of a statistical correlation. But in any event, if in response to the neoclassical challenge, the significance of Marx's theory of value is not only defended by arguing for the superiority of, quote, labor values as predictors of market prices, if, in other words, we defend Marx's theory from the charge that it is an unsound theory of price formation, by arguing that it is indeed a sound theory of price formation, then it is not only the first chapter of Capital which will have been bypassed, but in effect the greater part of the first 2 volumes. The analysis of which these volumes consist are, after all, expressly predicated upon the counterfactual assumption that prices do not deviate from values at all, that they are the, quote, same, or at least the ones are directly proportional to the others. Footnote: Marx makes this assumption explicit in elaborating upon what is arguably the core programmatic proposition of Capital Volume 1, namely that the, quote, transformation of money into capital is to be developed on the basis of the immanent laws of commodity exchange in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents, end quote. In a footnote to this sentence, Marx continues, quote, the formation of capital must be possible even though the price and value of a commodity be the same, for it cannot be explained by referring to any divergence between price and value. If prices actually differ from values, we must first reduce prices to values, i.e. disregard this circumstance as an accidental one, in order to have before us the phenomenon of the formation of capital on the basis of the exchange of commodities, in its purity, and not to be misled in its observation by interfering incidental circumstances which are alien to the genuine development, end quote. Marx. See also Capital Volume 2, where Marx reaffirms the need for this simplifying assumption. Having introduced the assumption of commodities exchanging, quote, at values, end quote, and justified it on methodological grounds, Marx does then go on to assert that not only in theory, but in economic practice itself, prices are in fact continually being reduced to a, quote, average price as their, quote, inherent norm, end quote, Innenregel. And furthermore, that these, quote, average prices are regulated in the, quote, last instance, end quote, by the value of commodities, but he does not treat the dynamics of this process until Volume 3. End footnote. Just as surely as the attacks on his detractors, such defenses of Marx clearly elude the question of the object and objectives of Marx's theory of value, which is to say, for the most part, they elude his theory of value. Footnote: the work of Anwar Shaikh represents just such an attempt at preserving, quote, orthodoxy in Marxian economics. See, for example, the article cited in Note 4 above. End footnote. Nonetheless, despite the glibness of the references to Hegel, which tend to decorate the economist's disagreements with respect to Marx, such allusions do at least direct us to what is a real problem, namely and crudely, that of determining just what exactly, if anything, is, quote, Hegelian about Marx's theoretical discourse in Marx's Capital. This particular process can, of course, only be resolved on the condition that we address in turn the question of what is in general distinctive about a, quote, Hegelian style of exposition as opposed to any other. What is, in effect, quote, Hegelian about Hegel? I hope it will be appreciated at any rate, when we come to treat this problem in greater detail, that it is not a simple matter of intellectual, quote, influences. It pertains rather to the logical structure of Marx's analysis, and hence ultimately bears upon the legitimacy of Marx's analysis. In this respect, incidentally, Marx's detractors among the economists have tended to show greater insight than his supporters, since his detractors, as noted, have applied the epithet of, quote, Hegelianism in order to absolve themselves of the obligation of engaging the details of his value theoretical analysis, thus at least in a backhanded manner, acknowledging that the aptness of this description would depend upon certain logical peculiarities which that argument exhibits. For his neoclassical critics, there is something about the logic of Marx's value theory which they find exotic, and in an off-putting fashion, of course. Before we have finished, I hope to be able to specify just what this, quote, something is, to show how it relates to the exotic qualities of so-called, quote, Hegelian logic, and finally, and most importantly, to demonstrate in what way this logically, quote, exotic aspect of Marx's analysis might be justified by the objectively, or ontologically bizarre constitution of the economic phenomena it is designed to grasp. Okay, so that is chapter 1 of The Myth of Dialectics, Reinterpreting the Marx-Hegel Relation by John Rosenthal. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for living as well, though.